Okay, so we have another way of looking at this, which is the way that Seymour Martin Lipset suggests looking at it in his chapter on legitimacy, is that we can think of this as two dimensions. People have, for whatever means, because of their values, their beliefs, their culture, historical circumstances, a strong belief in the legitimacy of democracy as the best form of government, or maybe alternatively a weak belief. Then independently they're making judgments about the performance of the democratic regime and whether it's effective or ineffective. If performance over time is very effective and people have these pretty well internalized beliefs in the legitimacy of democracy, then you've got a highly stable system. And this is what we've had in Europe and the United States, in the US, I'd say more or less for over 2 centuries, in Western Europe for 7 decades in the post-World War II period, in some countries longer than that. If you then get to a period of ineffective performance, but you have a high degree of legitimacy, no worries, because the period, a long period of effective performance before that, and the kind of cultural underpinnings of a natural cultural belief that democracy is a good system of government, the best system of government, at least except all the others, gives you a reservoir of legitimacy you can draw on in times of stress. So you have an economic depression in the 1930s. People remember, democracy's worked over a long period of time. Don't panic. You've got a financial collapse in 2008. You know, it's bad. We're going to get out of this. The system begins to respond. People's lives have been transformed for the better over many generations. They're not going to defect from democracy. Now, if legitimacy is low, then the system may persist for a long period of time, but it's contingent on more instrumental popular consent. By instrumental, I mean, what have you done for me lately? And if the system stops being effective in economic terms or political terms, then democracy is on thinner ground. And people may begin to defect from democracy, either to an authoritarian populist who's offering himself as a kind of instrument of salvation at the ballot box, or to a military coup, or in Peru in 1990 to Alberto Fujimori, and when he closes down Congress and suspends the Constitution in the midst of a crisis of order over the terrorist challenge of the insurgent group Sendero Luminoso and the economic crisis, people say, okay, we're behind you, because democracy obviously isn't working. When you've got ineffective performance and a low belief in the legitimacy of democracy, then that's when democracy is most unstable and is just kind of hanging on, or any regime, by force and fraud. This framework can be applied to non-democracies as well. Yes. That is a really good question. So there are 2 questions I wanted to ask you, and that is one of them. So let me repeat. Can you imagine a circumstance in which a regime, democratic or non-democratic, is very effective in performance over a long period of time and yet runs into significant legitimacy problems? Can any of you imagine a scenario by which that might happen? Because there is an argument in the literature that you will read about this.
potentially China.
Okay, spell it out.
Well, I guess this comes back to what we were talking about earlier, that we don't really have a good way of measuring legitimacy. So it's just very hard to say. We might guess that popular approval of the Chinese government is very much contingent instrumental, and I think it's probably just going to be hard to actually quantify that.
Okay, there's a different argument about China here. And that is that you have sustained economic development. It's doing great things for people. It's making them rich. It's lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and then 200-300 million, maybe more, into a very, very prosperous middle-class status. Certainly prosperous enough to come to Stanford University and appreciate as tourists what a wonderful campus we have. And then the argument goes, we're going to encounter this argument when we read a really seminal piece. It's based on a larger body of work, but out of deference to your limited time, it's the article by Christian Welzel and Ronald Engelhardt for January 29th on political culture change and the role of ordinary people in democratization. And it's simply this: economic development happens, people's material status changes, their material needs are met, and their values change. And they don't just care about material progress anymore. They want freedom, and they want personal dignity, and they want more autonomy. And it leads to a delegitimation of the system that has produced this remarkable progress because it isn't meeting their current needs, which are psychological needs for freedom and dignity and not just material security and prosperity. That's the answer to your question. Yeah?
So it seems like then it's not like, it could be, I think that it'd be hard to find an example of a state with effective performance and low legitimacy in the sense that they currently have low legitimacy because people could be pretty much convinced that this is what they want, but then in the near future, like possibly if their performance, ceases, or if they become wealthy enough to want for something more, then their legitimacy could be in trouble.
Right, right. It's, these things are dynamic. It's not just for one period of time. Okay, yeah?
I'm curious, so when you use the term legitimacy for a democratic regime, does it also apply to individual parties? I can think, for example, like in Brazil, maybe people still had faith in the whole idea of democracy, or at least people ruling, so they elected someone else.
Good. So the question is about the difference between the legitimacy of the system and the legitimacy of a particular party or maybe president or something like that. It's not a problem for democracy if people lose faith in a president or a presidential or prime ministerial government, a particular one, or if they come to view a political party as morally bankrupt and not really worthy of commanding respect. It's not a problem because those people are going to lose. They'll lose support. They'll be defeated at the polls, and democracy will renew itself. What becomes a problem is when people lose faith in all political parties and therefore in the system, and that's when the system is in trouble. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, but we have an example of Singapore.
Of?
Singapore?
Yeah.
Where people, as long as I understand, actually do support, and they would choose like less violence and crimes and prosperity instead of some rights.
Well, so this is an extraordinary thing about Singapore is that it's the most successful country in the world that is not a democracy. And it's the richest country in the world, at least in terms of its own organic economic development. So the richest non-oil country in the history of the world that's not a democracy. The argument has been, my argument has been that as Singapore grows wealthier and more economically developed, that values will gradually change and people will come to demand, again, more freedom. We have public opinion survey data to show that there has been a trend in that direction, and that young people in particular would like to see more freedom, more openness, more political pluralism, less authoritarian control, but it's very modest. And the regime has managed, to a degree that no other regime in history has, to kind of defy the odds in this regard. I will just note one other problem for you, okay? What happens when this is, in the context of this, so think of the advanced industrial democracies, when this is not a temporary phenomenon, when it's not a dip for a few years after a financial crisis or a slump, but we settle into a long period of declining economic performance, and in particular, declining or stagnating incomes for a whole generation of middle income and working income people. This is the debate that's going on now about the stability of advanced industrial democracies and the rise of nativist, illiberal, anti-immigrant parties and so on. Let me just get through a couple more slides. These, I think, then, if you just listen to what I said, are the principal threats to democratic legitimacy. The second Lipset reading for today is about what the sources of democratic legitimacy are. Where does it come from? I've already spoken about the performance dimension, but there are three others that I just want to note to you. One is it can come from just tradition. A system can be legitimate because it's conforming to what's always been there. The second is you can have a charismatic leader, a George Washington, a Lee Kuan Yew at the founding of the Singaporean regime, Nelson Mandela at the start of South African democracy, imbuing a new system with a strong sense of moral rightness because of his, or in a couple of cases, her charismatic authority. And that can be a way, at least a temporary way, it's not lasting, because the charismatic individual is a mortal human being. And so Weber argues that if you're going to kind of ignite a path to the creation of a new form of democratic legitimacy, it's got to be rooted over time in something that transcends personalities. And that's what he means by rational legal authority. Or think of it as constitutional legitimation of the system. Respect for the law, the Constitution, and impersonal legal authority. This then requires, Lipset argues, this is a hugely important point, a separation between the source of authority, which in a democracy should be the Constitution, and the particular agent of authority. And that's why it was so important. Lipset has actually written a separate article about this. That's why it was so important that George Washington stepped down after 2 terms as President of the United States. He made clear that that authority did not stem from an individual, and there wasn't going to be another king. That the supreme authority was the Constitution, and that had to be separated from any individual. And it's why Nelson Mandela is saying, look, I'm here, I'm 5 years, I'm only going to serve 1 term. He steps down in 1999 when he could have gone on forever, I can assure you, was a seminal event for South Africa and its democracy in establishing the same thing and getting that transition from charismatic to rational legal or constitutional authority is one of the central problems for new democracies. I want to end with this slide, and if you could just pass out my favorite piece of paper in the class. I realize that this looks like a badly designed transit system, but I do want to say this. The rest of the course is about this slide, okay? And that's why I'm giving you a hard copy of it. I want you to study it. I want you to put it under your pillow. And if you wake up in the middle of the night, I want you to look at it and really ponder it. And for now, I'm going to just note this. This final box here is called democratic stability. The stability, and if you will, we can debate whether this is a useful word, the consolidation of liberal democracy, okay? This is a flow chart in terms of causal diagram. I know it looks overwhelming and intimidating, but it's an effort, imperfect and maybe slightly preposterous, to integrate everything else we're talking about in the class. Note that almost all these other factors flow through legitimacy. And the impact of almost everything else, we were talking about performance, development, and so on, we'll get to other factors, is impacted on democracy as it is mediated by beliefs about democratic legitimacy. So if you internalize and master this slide, you'll get an A in the class. And if you don't, you're on your own. Okay? Thank you.